the hot, dust-laden air of the Persian Gulf in early 2026, the plan seemed straightforward and decisive. Donald Trump, back in command, viewed Iran as the final major obstacle to a regional order favorable to American and Israeli interests. The joint air operations, given epic-sounding names, swept the skies with surgical precision. Leaders fell, facilities were reduced to rubble, and part of the Iranian Navy became scrap metal on the seabed. It looked like the end of an era of persistent threats. But the regime did not collapse. Instead, it responded with a tenacity that turned what should have been a swift strike into a prolonged conflict, full of unpredictable costs and bitter lessons about the limits of power, even when overwhelming. Two statements capture the divided spirit of this moment. Ebrahim Zolfikari, the Iranian military spokesman, addressed the adversary directly in English, with a tone mixing provocation and cold calculation. "Hey Trump, you are fired," he said, echoing the president's own style. It was not just theater. It was a message aimed at the American domestic audience, exploiting political divisions and portraying the conflict as an unnecessary adventure draining resources and lives. On the other side, Benjamin Netanyahu celebrated the daring rescue of an American pilot shot down over Iranian territory. "Congratulations, President Trump. All Israelis rejoice with the incredible rescue of a brave American pilot by America's fearless warriors." The words invoked shared courage and the principle that no one is left behind. Two opposing narratives, each shaping perceptions and justifying positions in a war already slipping from the initial scripts. To understand how the Trump administration found itself in this uncomfortable position, one must look at Iran not as an abstract target, but as a country of flesh, bone, mountains, and history. This is not a fragile, centralized state like Iraq decades ago, where an invasion could reach the capital in weeks. Iran stretches across arid expanses, mountain ranges like the Zagros that serve as natural walls, deserts that swallow armies, and a geography that favors asymmetric defense. Its forces, divided between the regular army and the Revolutionary Guard, number in the hundreds of thousands, many hardened by years of sanctions, regional conflicts, and a doctrine that prioritizes resilience over direct confrontation. The Navy, modest in large ships, masters tactics of fast boats, mines, and anti-ship missiles. The Air Force, limited in modern aircraft, integrates with a dense network of ground defenses. Weapons experts had long warned that underestimating these elements would lead to surprises. The first weeks of bombings were, at first glance, impressive. Hundreds of sorties destroyed visible launchers, headquarters, and key infrastructure. Important regime figures were eliminated, creating vacuums that seemed fatal. However, Iran's internal structures, forged over decades of isolation and distrust, allowed for quick replacements. New commanders emerged, many more radical, willing to prolong the fight as an existential survival issue. The regime did not crumble because its resilience does not depend solely on a leadership core, but on a parallel network of power that absorbs losses and adapts. Airstrikes decapitate leaders, but do not destroy the collective while painted as resistance against external invaders. Trump sent Marine reinforcements to the region, signaling that limited ground operations could follow. The idea was to press until the breaking point. But the terrain imposes brutal limits. Invading Iran would require hundreds of thousands of troops, exposed supply lines across the Gulf, and confrontation with ground forces that, despite damage, remain numerous and motivated by defense of the homeland. Previous military simulations already indicated that such an endeavor would be costly in lives, resources, and time, reminiscent of prolonged occupations that bled superpowers in the past. Air power dominates the skies, but Iranian soil, with its caves, tunnels, and populations that close ranks against foreigners, swallows ambitions of quick control. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz became the sharpest knife at the coalition's throat. Iran declared selective control over the passage, effectively closing it to American and Allied ships while allowing conditional traffic to others, with requirements for transactions outside the dollar. Attacks on Gulf infrastructure and persistent threats raised oil prices to levels that threaten not only global economies, but the very status of the dollar as a reserve currency. Importing countries seek alternative routes, and bilateral agreements in different currencies gain strength. What began as an operation to protect energy interests ended up accelerating trends that weaken American financial hegemony. A bitter irony for an administration that promised prosperity and an end to endless wars. European leaders watch with divided caution. The European Union, already burdened with other challenges, calls for de-escalation and prioritizes energy stability. Capitals like Berlin, Paris, and Brussels avoid direct military commitments, fearing a conflict that would drain resources and inflame domestic public opinion. China condemns the attacks as a violation of sovereignty, strengthens ties with Tehran and Moscow, and sees opportunity in a world where American attention is distracted. Russia pragmatically benefits from high energy prices and Western divisions. Think tanks and foreign policy analysts from different spectrums see here a classic dilemma. Every offensive move generates countermoves that amplify the chaos. In the military field, Iranian capabilities revealed adaptations that surprised many. Despite surface losses, underground stocks of missiles and drones allowed constant retaliations against American bases, Israel, and Gulf allies. The Revolutionary Guard's Navy uses asymmetric tactics that turn the strait into a hostile environment, where each interception costs the attacker dearly. The Air Force, modest in quality, compensates with integration into ground systems that force enemy aircraft to operate with restrictions. Technical analysts have long pointed out the economic imbalance. Cheap drones against expensive interceptors create unsustainable attrition for the side with technological superiority. Imagine the daily life of an American or Israeli soldier in the Gulf. Sweltering heat, constant alerts from cheap drones that saturate radars, and the feeling that every tactical victory does not change the larger strategic picture. The rescue of the American pilot, celebrated with pomp, symbolizes determination and noble values, but also exposes vulnerabilities. Downed aircraft remind us that air dominance is not absolute. Zulfikari, with his English provocation, exploits exactly the internal American fissures, where debates about costs, priorities, and outcomes divide opinions in Congress and on the streets. Geographically, Iran is a formidable adversary. The mountains create natural barriers ideal for ambushes and hidden bases. The central desert allows mobility for irregular forces, while coastal plains concentrate dense defenses. The population, diverse and with internal discontent, tends to unite against external threats, as Persian history has shown over centuries of invasions. Ground forces, with aged but numerous tanks, artillery, and infantry trained in defensive doctrine, represent a challenge beyond air bombings. The Navy focuses on attrition warfare in the Gulf, mining routes and threatening ships with accessible armaments. None of this was completely destroyed in the first waves of attacks. Economists observe the impact with growing concern. Rising energy prices affect global supply chains, from food in Asia to industries in Europe. The petrodollar faces subtle but cumulative pressures when straight transactions require alternative currencies. China and Russia gain indirect momentum, accelerating multipolarity movements. In Europe, internal debates question automatic alignment with Washington, prioritizing domestic energy interests. Diplomats in international forums amplify criticisms, positioning rival powers as voices of relative stability. Humanly, the crisis takes its daily toll. Families of American service members follow the news with anxiety, alternating between pride in heroic rescues and fear of escalation. Ordinary Iranians in Tehran, Isfahan, or southern ports deal with shortages, propaganda, and the weight of a war that paints the enemy as existential. Leadership replacements in the regime show bureaucratic adaptability. New generals swear vengeance and mobilize reservists, turning losses into a narrative of resistance. Soldiers on the ground face boredom interspersed with adrenaline spikes, questioning the purpose when partial victories bring no end in sight. The sarcasm arises inevitably when observing initial promises of shock and awe against the reality of a conflict that drags on. An administration that swore to avoid endless wars found itself in one that, without a decisive victory, threatens to consume resources and prestige. Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth defend a hard line, arguing that retreating would be unforgivable weakness. But internal reports and independent analyses suggest doubts about timelines and clear objectives. Amphibious landings, even limited to islands or ports like Karg, risk becoming traps exposed to crossfire from militias and regular forces. Geography and Iranian capabilities turn what seemed like surgery into a prolonged and bloody operation. Observers like John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, among other longtime watchers, highlight the fundamental miscalculation, underestimating the survival will of a determined state, even weakened. Iran does not seek conventional victory but prolongation that makes any occupation prohibitively expensive. Economists like Sachs warn of the empire's weakening by distracting from larger priorities, such as competition with China. European and Asian diplomats, in private conversations, express frustration with a strategy that ignores lessons from past conflicts. Think tanks from Washington to Beijing analyze the scenario as a security dilemma where actions generate amplifying reactions. The operations destroyed much of the Iranian surface navy, but specialized units maintain mine-laying and naval drone attack capabilities. The strait, with its narrow width at critical points, favors defenders. American warships, no matter how advanced, operate in an environment saturated with cheap threats. Marine reinforcements signal intent, but logistics impose challenges. Vulnerable supplies, risk of asymmetric attacks, and fatigue of globally stretched forces. China observes and strengthens presence in nearby waters, while Russia provides indirect support. Long-term impacts project volatility. Energy spikes affect agriculture, industries, and homes across multiple continents. Agreements in yuans or other currencies gain ground. In Europe, voices call for independent mediation. Military analysts acknowledge operational successes, but question the absence of a clear theory of victory. The Iranian regime, adapting, consolidates internal power by redirecting discontent toward the external threat. Potential protests are contained or channeled. At the heart of the bind is the dilemma. Declaring premature victory exposes fragility. Proceeding risks greater catastrophe. Negotiating requires concessions. Escalating drains resources that could go to other rivals. Iran survives because its structures are resilient, its geography defensive, and its forces adaptable. Airstrikes weaken, but do not eradicate underground capacity. Landings repeat historical risks of occupations that become quagmires. Supreme irony. A war to contain Iran and protect global interests accelerated questions about both. Gulf countries recalibrate alliances between fear and opportunity. The coalition, strong in the air, fragile in sustainability. The selective closure of Hormuz forces costly reroutings and raises maritime costs. Demands for alternative currencies deepen trends already underway. Economists predict years of instability if the impasse persists. Pilots rescued in daring operations symbolize bravery, but also daily risks. Iranian civilians face shortages and uncertainty. Diplomats negotiate behind the scenes for exits that preserve dignities without admitting defeats. The raw realism emerges. States seek security in an anarchic world, where geography, capabilities, and narratives weigh more than declared intentions. Trump sought to maximize American advantage, but Iran exploited gaps to resist and counterattack. As weeks turn into months, hard choices impose themselves. The absence of a clear exit strategy turns tactical successes into strategic challenges. The regime does not succumb easily because its resilience goes beyond individual leaders. The bind defines the moment, reminding us that on the geopolitical board, well-positioned pawns can complicate Queen's moves. The Middle East, once again, imposes humility on the powerful, teaching that overwhelming military power does not substitute for deep understanding of the adversary, the terrain, and the unpredictable consequences.